Good morning.
Good morning.
It is good to be here. As I mentioned in Bible class, we have our mix set up today, and we would love for you to come by. We'll have a Coca-Cola for every one of you. It'll be chilled down, a little glass bottle, even a moon pie for you if you want one of those. But especially, we just want to connect with you. I know there's a lot of people here that have loved Freed Hardeman for a long time. You pray regularly for Freed Hardeman. You support Freed Hardeman. You send your children there, and in all the ways that you are connected, we thank you. And we just want to stop by today to say thank you for that. And there may be others that aren't as familiar with Freed Hardeman, when we love to answer any questions that you have and just share in any concerns that you have. It truly is a wonderful, wonderful place. I appreciate Cole and the great job they did leading singing, and he is just a great example of what Freed Hardeman is about. We have just such wonderful young people there that our goal and our mission is to help them grow academically and develop in every way that they can be successful in their careers and in the dreams that they have. But also our mission is to help them take steps closer to God. And our desire and our expectation is that when a young person comes to us at 18, even if they are already a faithful Christian, our expectation is that when they leave at 22 or 23 years of age, that they will have grown in their faith. It's not just for us, it's not just the idea of survival, but it's the idea of helping young people become young adults that are very strong and very committed in their faith. 2 words, Christian education, and that really is a great description of us. I appreciate Cody and Josh and the work that they do here in this congregation. Appreciate the elders and the opportunity that you give us to be here today. Appreciate the scripture that's already been capably read, and if you will, be opening back up to Timothy in the first chapter there. And appreciate Dr. Sewell and his prayer, and he's of course served as president for Freed Hardeman for a couple of decades, and just has been such a blessing to Freed Hardeman for many, many decades before and after that, as well as during that, of course. When I was at Freed Hardeman in the 80s, between my junior and senior year, I participated in an internship. And of course, we strongly encourage our young people even today to continue doing that. It's such a vital part of their career development. But it also is a way to see other parts of the nation, and it's a way to even meet other Christian families. And there's so much good that can come out of that. And so I was in another state, and I was living with a Christian family. And on this particular morning, it was, as most other mornings, I was in the kitchen at this particular moment. I think I was getting something out of the refrigerator. The mother of the house there was still preparing breakfast. She'd always just kind of cook for a while, and her sons and others that were living there would come and go. And at this particular moment, 2 of her sons, one was 13 and one was 17, and they were there at the kitchen table, and the phone rings. And just hearing her side of the conversation, you could really tell nothing about the conversation, because she just answered with a little short, either words or phrases. And it would have sounded something like this. Now, who's this? When? Where? Now, who is this again? Why? She hangs up the phone. And she looks toward her sons, but she kind of looks beyond them, and she just says the words, Dustin is dead. And he was one of their brothers. And this family had already known the loss of a teenage son. And so immediately one of the boys, utensil just fell out of his mouth. And together they chimed in, Mom, what happened? What happened? And when she further explained, she said, your brother died spiritually. He's dead. Now, of course, they became very aggravated at their mother with loud voices of tones of correction. They said, Mom, you scared us. We thought you meant that he really died. Mom, you shouldn't do that. Why would you scare us like that? To which she looked at them and said, your brother has really died. Your brother is dead spiritually. I knew this family well, and later I asked her, I said, which is more difficult? Is it more difficult that you've lost a son who was thriving spiritually but died physically? Or is it more difficult to lose a son spiritually that is very much alive physically? And she said, it's so much harder to lose your son spiritually. And she was very much aware of the fact of God's grace and God's mercy, and for the opportunity for that son to come back like the prodigal son coming back home. But I tell you that to remind all of us that really that's a description of everybody that's here today and everybody that we know. There aren't three paths. When Jesus spoke in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke about two paths. And He decided to describe them based also on their gates of entrance. And He said that there was this wide gate and that there was a broad way that led up to that wide gate. And He said that many will go therein. But then He spoke of this narrow gate. And it's interesting, if you're reading in the New King James Version, He says that this, He doesn't call this way, He calls the gate narrow, but He calls the way difficult. And He says, few there be that will find it. And it is this sobering reality that just like this morning, everyone here, we're on one path or the other. And I want to remind you of what we've already implied. Every path has a destination. Like right now, this morning, if you and I were on Interstate 40, you remember it runs all the way across the United States, almost coast to coast. It's east to west. Now imagine if we were on that path this morning and someone said in the vehicle, I can't wait for us to see Canada from I-40. You say, you can't see Canada from I-40. This path doesn't lead that way. Do you realize the path you're on this morning has a destination? I know that's simple, but let that sink in. It is foolish to be on a path and desire a destination that path does not lead to. There's only one narrow gate and there's only one path that leads to that. At least here in North America, our greatest challenge in the church, I'm giving you my opinion, and I understand that, but I don't know of any problem that rivals the problem I'm about to mention to you. Our greatest challenge in North America is faith after high school. Faith after high school. 50% of our young people by the age of 19 will be spiritually dead. That's more serious than physical death. It's very difficult to accept. And it's something that ought to bother every one of us, so much so that we all join in and say, we have to do something about this. That is completely unacceptable. And so what could we do? It's that year that begins the graduation day of high school and for the next 12 months. What could we do that at the end of that year, when that young person is 19, 20, and 21, instead of being unfaithful to the Lord, during those years, we're not concerned about them surviving. During those years, we're watching them thrive. We're watching them grow deeper in their faith, to expand their knowledge of God and His Word, and to increase their experiences of service so that they are becoming more and more capable to do greater things in the Lord's kingdom. What is it that we could do to help make that a reality? When we think about what our response often is as a congregation and as a church family, we seem to go to extremes, don't we? It's kind of our human nature. When something is a big problem, we tend to go to extremes. And so one extreme is, and this Generation Z that we're talking about right now, the idea would be, let's just study them inside out. Let's see how they think. Let's see what motivates them. Let's see how they operate. And what is it that we as a church family could do? And let's do everything for this generation. But the problem is, anytime a church marries one generation, they become a widow to the next. And when you think about it, it was never God's design that the church be all about one generation. God's design is that the church is for every generation. But then there's this other extreme. And the other extreme is, let's just pretend like it doesn't happen. Let's just pretend like we're not going to lose 50%. And let's pretend like we didn't lose 50% of last year's 18-year-olds. And let's pretend we didn't lose 50% of the year before that, or the year before that, or the year before that. Let's just pretend it didn't happen. But we know it happens, and I can give you an example, and I'll step on my own toes and work my way back. How's that sound? When's the last time you've talked to someone that's 20, 21, 22 years old? They grew up here, they attended here. Whether they came from the community or one of your families, they were here all throughout high school. It's been a couple of years since you've seen them, and you run into them in the store. What do you ask them about? We tend to ask them about everything except what? Their soul, where they're going to church, how involved are they? Why do we not ask? Well, the reason we don't ask is because we know that about 50% probability that they're not going anywhere. That they're no longer committed to the God that they one time were committed to. And so we like to sweep it under the rug and pretend that it doesn't happen. And after a short visit that might go like this, hey, where are you going to school right now? Where are you working right now? What branch of the military are you in? Oh, really? How's your mom and dad doing? Great, great, great. Good to see you. Glad you're doing so. And that's the end. Why is that the end? Because we love to sweep it under the rug. We love to pretend that it was completely normal, that a soul has died, we've not seen them in 2 years, and we show no involvement in their life or their soul. I'm not saying we do that because we're horrible people, but I am asking you today, is it right? Should that be our mode of operation? I suggest to you that away from this idea that we ought to become a church family, that everything we do is focusing on 18-year-olds, or unless we become a family that if you're 19 through about 23, 24 years old, we'd have no expectations and we're not keeping up with you. If you make it, great. If you don't, we're going to pretend it's great. There has to be something in between that is righteous. And I know there are a lot of details. There are a lot of programs that have been designed. When I was in full-time ministry and preaching, this was one of the problems that bothered me over and over, and we constantly did things to try to grow high school students so that they could bridge that gap into young adulthood, and that they would do that in a faithful way. And so I'm saying that to say to you, I'm not opposed to programs, and I'm not opposed to us figuring out things to do. I'm just saying this lesson is not about a program. What I want us to do is look in the Holy Scriptures, and I want us to see an example where we see a relationship that is so strong and so real that it made an impact on a young man's life. And if we could duplicate that with every one of our young people, how amazing would our life be? Because our life's going to be enriched, but it's also going to change the young people's lives. And so when we look at this relationship, it's a relationship between Paul and Timothy. And you remember in 2 Timothy, this is the last book that we have that was written by Paul. And remember the 4th chapter? He is waiting to be executed. So this idea of being in a very difficult time, a very difficult place, but what's on his mind? Is he shaking in his boots and saying, I dread dying? No. We see a calm and a peace about him. And he writes 2 Timothy, especially the first 7 or 8, 9 verses. His great concern is, let me reach over to Timothy, my son in the faith, and let me try to encourage him and let me try to prod him along, because I'm getting the vibe, I'm getting the feeling that he's not doing as well spiritually right now as he did at one time. In verse 1, if you want to scan, you see in verse 1, he identifies himself as an apostle. And in verse 2, he tells who he's writing to. And he says, to Timothy. But notice the description, a beloved son. Now that's interesting when we are pretty sure that there was no relationship genetically or blood relationship. Why would he call him a son? Why would he call him a beloved son? And you know, the word beloved simply means to love well or to love much. And so why does Paul, who has no physical relationship to this young man, write to him and call him a son I love much. And what's interesting is to think back at the end of the first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas are ready to start a second missionary journey. But remember, they have a sharp conflict because John Mark had left them. Another young man had left them on the first missionary journey. And so now they're ready to start the second missionary journey. And Barnabas says, I want to take my relative with me, John Mark, again. Paul is not having any part of it. They literally split their mission work. They're not going to go on the same trip. Paul takes Silas with him. One of the first stops they make is in Acts, the 16th chapter. And there's something really, really beautiful there. In verse 1, we have the introduction to Timothy. And it tells us about his mother being a Jewish woman, implying she's a woman of faith. But then his father was Greek, Acts 16 and 1, implying that he was not a man of faith. And we know from reading 1 and 2 Timothy both that it was his mother and his grandmother that taught him the Scriptures from the time that he was a child. With that in mind, we see something that's powerful in verse 2. In Acts 16, he says in verse 2, talking about Timothy, he was well spoken of by who were at Lystra and Iconium. Now notice this phrase. I love this phrase. Paul wanted to have him to go with him. How powerful is that? Here's this man that a young man had already messed up their first missionary journey. And now it's time he's already on now his second missionary journey. And he stops in Lystra and Derbe, and there are these, you can just imagine what the setting might have been. A few people standing around in the congregation, and they kind of motion over at that young man. Hey, Paul, you see that young man Timothy there? Wow. They spoke well of him. Really impressive young man. Maybe they were talking about his mother and grandmother have taught him the Scriptures so well. Let me tell you, when you hear that young man speak, you realize he's got great ability. When you spend time with him, you see his heart. They were speaking well of him. And instead of Paul saying, hey, I've tried investing time in those young people, they let you down. Let me tell you about that previous missionary trip I just came off of. Not only did it mess up the first missionary trip, now it's messed up the second missionary trip. Paul and Barnabas, we're not working together anymore. Instead, this man who is in one generation of life looks over to someone who is in an earlier generation than him, and he says, I want him to go with me. I want to ask you today, who are you going to reach down to that may be in junior high right now or early high school? And who will you set to say, I want to be a continual encouragement to them? And I especially ask you, that's not blood related to you. It really is a powerful, powerful example that Paul gives us. Because when that relationship is established, it becomes not a program, but it becomes a real relationship. You say, how real was this relationship? Let's read on again in verse 3 and 4. And I want you to notice how real this is. I'm going back to 2 Timothy. I want you to notice how real this is. Especially the last part of 3 and 4. Notice this. But I'm going to begin reading in verse 3 of 2 Timothy 1. I thank God whom I serve with a pure conscience, as my forefathers did, as without ceasing. Notice this. I remember you. Paul saying to Timothy, without ceasing, I remember you in my prayers, night and day, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of the tears that I may be filled with joy. How powerful is that? Here's this man he's not in the same season of life. Here's this man who has no blood relation. But some way their relationship has become so genuine that he's able to write a letter to him and he's able to say to him, hey, I remember you. Every night and every day, I pray for you. I am looking forward, greatly desiring to spend time with you. I'm mindful of what's brought tears to your eyes. So let me ask you, I want you to think back at least one season previous to you. Who is it that's not in your blood family, that's a season younger than you, that you've been praying for them every day this past month, this past year, this past decade? And you're mindful. You remember them every day. You're not praying for them just because they're on a list. You're praying for them because you have a genuine relationship. You remember them. You pray for them. And you can't wait to see them. Imagine when that junior in college is constantly receiving a text from you, an email from you, or a phone call from you because you've been in touch with them since they're junior. Keep in mind, what we're talking about today, you can't have with multiple, with a lot of, we're not saying have this type of relationship with 5 different young people. You can't have this type. This is one of those where you pick 1 or 2 and you stay with them throughout a lifetime. And imagine that individual is a junior in college. Most college students right now are stressed. Finals is coming up. And imagine, you know that. You know they're stressed because you know what's going on in their life. Notice how Paul says, I'm mindful of your tears. Let's give a little litmus test. Somebody a season younger than you, that's not your blood relative, I want to ask you, why did they cry last? And you might say, how would I know what made them cry last? And that would be the point made. Who is going to keep first make and then keep or maintain that relationship with our young people beyond high school? One of the biggest transitions a person will go through is from high school to that next step. It's one of the biggest transitions in life. Whether it's high school to college, high school to the military, high school to the workforce. It's one of the biggest transitions in life. Now I want to ask adults here. If you were to go through a major transition in your life, how would you feel if you were coming into a church family and no one asked you about it? No one stayed in touch with you about it, and no one seemed to care. That's a little bit like what our high schoolers go through when they graduate and they don't have anybody in the church family where they have a genuine relationship, where someone is genuinely thinking about them because since 8th grade they've built a relationship. Somebody's praying for them by name every day. Somebody's looking forward. Hey, next time you come in, you come have supper with us. Or let's meet up for coffee. And they're mindful of what that individual is going through. I know this is a tough time of the year. Just want you to know I was thinking about you. But notice it isn't only the genuine relationship, which is very important, but what that does is it opens up the doorway of opportunity to care about genuine faith. You see, because Paul had invested in his life to have genuine relationship, he had the opportunity to say something like this and have impact. Look at verse 5. In verse 5 he says to Timothy, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, I am persuaded it's in you also. There was a time in my life where I thought that Paul was just kind of giving Timothy a report. And it sounds silly, but it's just like, okay, he's writing and he's just, when you get to verse 5, what's he doing? He's just giving Timothy a report about Timothy's faith. Well, you have genuine faith, son. Your grandmother and grandmother had genuine faith. Just wanted you to know that. You think that's what he was doing? If not, what was he doing? How does this verse fit into life, to Paul and Timothy's life, when he says, I believe you have that genuine faith. And then he closes out that verse by saying, I am persuaded you have that genuine faith? Well, anytime you read a verse, you have to put it in context. When you put this verse in context, you have to take it down to verse 8. In verse 8, you see what was on Paul's mind when he's writing this. And what verse 8 reveals to us, what was on Paul's mind, and put 7 and 8 together, he knew that Timothy was struggling with fear because Timothy is looking to his father figure and realizing the father figure is waiting to die. Why is he going to be executed? Because he's a gospel preacher. What is Timothy? He's a preacher of the gospel. So if my mentor is about to be executed for preaching the gospel, how much longer will it be before they're ready to execute me for preaching the gospel? And so perhaps for Timothy, this faith that at one time he was so certain of, perhaps now fear has crept in. And he's not so certain about that. And you know what the powerful thing about having a mentor in your life is you have someone that can read the situation because they walked in your season of life. And you can imagine Paul looking back to Timothy and thinking, I remember being his age and being afraid. And I remember the questions I would ask. Is this faith really worth it? Am I really going to stand up? And am I really going to lay down my life for this? And now with that in mind, hear Paul say, I know about the genuine faith. I know about the genuine faith your mother and your grandmother have. I know them well. But now listen when he says this. I am persuaded that it's in you also, son. Now how powerful is that? When he can say to him, I know the fear, I know what you're going through, and I even know that you're doubting yourself. And even though right now you may not be persuaded that you have that genuine faith, I'm looking back in life and I'm looking back at you. I know the ministry you've been doing the last few years because Paul's been involved in that ministry. He's the one that started him on that missionary trip and then gave him so many other opportunities. He knows him and he knows he's going to make it. He knows what Timothy does not even know. And he's there to persuade him of what he's already persuaded. I want to give you an example of this, and it's on a much lesser importance, but just to jog your thinking to see how powerful mentorships are. You know, when Tracy and I got married, we soon after we had our family, and I remember not having 2 nickels to rub together. Time you bought the diapers and the groceries, and we only had 1 car, not because we didn't need 2 cars, we couldn't afford 2 cars. And we were just making ends meet every month. That's all we could do. But I grew up always saving some. You always gave to the Lord first, you saved some, and you lived off the rest. Always. First got married, same order. Started having babies. Still gave the Lord first. Didn't have anything to save hardly. Lived off the rest. And barely lived off the rest. After a couple of years of that, it really began to bother me. And it really started to kind of get me down. And one day I kind of mustered up the courage to look to my mentor, who was my father. And one day I remember just saying to him, he said, Dad, I said, it really, really bothers me that right now all I can do is pay the bills. I said, Dad, we're not spending anything extra. We're not going out to eat. We're not spending anything extra. And I don't have hardly anything to save at the end of a month. And honestly, I expected him to say, well, son, you just got to figure out. You're going to have to save something. So I was kind of nervous about that, but it was so heavy on me, I wanted to share it with him. I'll never forget him looking over at me, and not disrespectfully, but with a lighter spirit and a smile. I remember him looking over and saying, son, if you've got 2 babies and you're paying your bills, you're doing pretty good. And then he said, It won't be that much longer. You'll be able to save money again. Just give it another year or two. A burden was lifted. Because I knew he'd walked through my season. I knew him well and trusted his wisdom. And you know what? He was exactly right. It's wonderful when we have Christian friends that are our age. But if our high schoolers and age and young adult, if the only guidance they're seeking are from their peers, they're missing out on what God has designed. You're probably not going to make it if your spiritual strength is only coming from the people that are your age. And so here's Paul. He's formed this genuine relationship where he knows them by name. He prays for them. They've lived life together. He can't wait to spend time with him again. And then he tells him, as if to say, I know you're doubting your faith right now, but I know who you are, and I even know where your faith came from. And I'm persuaded it's in you also. And it was from that, and we'll just have to make these points quickly. I just want you to see it, and we'll close this lesson, though I know we're out of time. But look what he says in verse 6, when he then says to him, I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. In other words, Paul says, I know you have spiritual gifts. I was the one that miraculously gave them to you. He says, but now, notice he says, I want to remind you to stir up your gifts. I've heard people say, and Paul was saying Paul was going to stir up the gifts. Read it. He didn't say that. Paul said, I'm reminding you to stir up your gifts. I can't make you use your gifts of service, Paul is saying, but I can do this. I can be your mentor that encourages you and reminds you you ought to stir up, you ought to rekindle your gifts. And so, in other words, I know what you're capable of doing, and I want you to get busy, and I want you to do it. So now, not only we have a genuine relationship, genuine faith, but we have genuine service. But then he closes, or we'll close this, by looking at the genuine courage. Look at the next verse. Verse 7, for God has not given us a spirit of fear. See, Timothy was wrestling with that. So Paul has a relationship with him to challenge him and to speak boldly. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. You see, when we build those genuine relationships, we also buy the right. We purchase the right to speak openly and honestly. You know the reason we have a hard time saying to that 21-year-old that we run in the middle of Walmart? You know why we have a hard time saying to them, hey, where are you worshiping now? One reason why we have a hard time doing that is we haven't purchased the right to do that. We have invested nothing in that person spiritually for years. So now, why do we get to walk up and do it now? Whereas Paul had invested so much of his life for years in young Timothy. So when he thought Timothy was starting to shake a little bit in his faith, he had bought the right to challenge him about, I'm persuaded you can be genuine. Oh, and by the way, son, what you need to do, and I'm reminding you right now, you need to stir the gift up again. You really need to get a little more busy serving. Oh, and by the way, son, I know why you're not serving. You're afraid right now. And I just want to be bold enough to tell you, that fear didn't come from God, so you can figure out where it came from. Let me tell you what God gave you, Timothy. God gave you the spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. God will give you the power to overcome anything you're facing, Timothy, even if it's death. God will give you love that's stronger than any. God will give you a sound mind. Timothy, right now you're probably having moments where you're thinking, I don't know what to do. God will give you a clear thinking mind to give you the knowledge and the wisdom so you'll know what you need to do. Can you imagine if every 18-year-old in America that's a part of the Lord's church had 4 or 5 people in his or her life that was not a part of their family, that had built up that kind of genuine relationship and was just naturally praying for them every day, looking forward to seeing them. And when something's wrong, they know what's bringing tears to their eyes. And so they can walk ahead of them in life and be able to talk lovingly and boldly to them about their faith, about their service, and about what scares them to death. It's not easy to be 18 and 19 years old. And most won't make it spiritually unless there's somebody older than that that's heavily involved in their life. And so today, I want to challenge you. If you don't have somebody in your life that you're reaching back a season behind, I want to challenge you to find them, just one or two of them, and start investing continually in their life. God is good to us. If you want to become a part of the best family that's ever been, it's God's family. If you've never been baptized or immersed into Christ for the remission of your sins, why not this morning? Are you a believer? Are you willing to repent of sins? Confess that Jesus is the Son of God? Why not become a child of His today? Maybe you are a child, but maybe sin has separated you from God, and today is the day you're ready to come back on the right path that leads to the right destination. If we can help in any way, come as we stand, as we sing.